For nearly 2 decades, dozens of victims of Hurricane Katrina remained nameless ghosts. In August 2005, one of the most destructive storms in American history not only shattered cities, but also erased identities, leaving behind a legacy of unresolved grief for families clinging to hope. But time, which buries so many secrets, can also uncover them. Today, we're looking at how a combination of dogged journalism and revolutionary science finally brought names to 2 of these silent victims, solving mysteries that had been cold for 20 years. This is the story of how science and determination can give a name back to the unknown. When Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast, it created a crisis of identification on an unprecedented scale. The storm surge that swamped New Orleans and the coasts of Louisiana and Mississippi left behind a toxic, murky landscape. In Louisiana alone, the death toll surpassed 1,400. To handle the immense and grim task of recovering and identifying the deceased, the federal government deployed the Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team, or DMORT. These experts, forensic pathologists, anthropologists, and odontologists, set up a massive temporary morgue in St. Gabriel, Louisiana to begin their work. The challenges were monumental. Many victims had been in contaminated floodwaters for weeks in the sweltering heat, making visual identification impossible and degrading fingerprints. The storm also destroyed the very records needed for identification. Dental offices were flooded, washing away patient charts. Families who could provide DNA samples or medical histories were themselves displaced, scattered across the nation. Despite heroic efforts, a significant number of victims couldn't be identified. By 2006, 84 unidentified or unclaimed victims from the New Orleans area were laid to rest in crypts at the Hurricane Katrina Memorial on Canal Street. For years, 30 of those crypts held individuals whose names were known only to God. For nearly 20 of those years, one of them was an 81-year-old woman named Dorothy Virginia Driggers Taquino. Her family called her Aunt Dot. A widow, she lived alone in a small house in Araby, a suburb of New Orleans. In the frantic hours before the storm hit, her niece Jean Driggers made an agonizing choice. With the hurricane bearing down, she had to evacuate her own mother. Leaving Aunt Dot behind was a decision that would haunt her for years. After the storm, Dorothy's home was found completely inundated. On September 12, 2005, her remains were discovered inside. Her body was taken to the morgue in St. Gabriel. Jean Driggers did what thousands of others did. She called the Family Assistance Hotline and submitted a DNA sample, hoping for a match that would confirm her worst fears. But in the chaos, an official identification was never made. The family was told the DNA sample wasn't sufficient, a common problem with the technology of the time, especially with degraded remains and samples from more distant relatives. Dorothy Taquino was officially lost, and her remains were interred in one of those anonymous crypts. The case went cold. The breakthrough came nearly 2 decades later. Not from a new technology, but from classic investigative journalism. In the summer of 2025, ahead of the storm's 20th anniversary, Devin Bartolotta, a reporter for WWL Louisiana, launched a project called Bringing Dorothy Home. Her goal was to shine a light on the 30 unidentified individuals at the memorial. The news station filed public records requests and sifted through over 800 autopsy reports from the original DMORT operation. One case stood out. It was a woman found in Araby, wearing a very specific piece of jewelry, a necklace engraved with the words Joseph Kahn High School. This was the key. The news station contacted Ray Theriot, the chief investigator for the St. Bernard Parish Coroner's Office, the jurisdiction where the body was found. Spurred by this new lead, Theriot reopened the cold case. He launched a painstaking, old-school investigation. He pulled utility bills, driver's license files, and property records, all of which confirmed that a woman matching the victim's description, Dorothy Taquino, had lived at that address. The final, definitive piece of evidence came from the archives of the Orleans Parish School System. There, Theriot found Dorothy Taquino's 1942 high school diploma from Joseph Cohn High School, a perfect match to the necklace she wore, even in death. For Jean Driggers, the news was a shock. After 20 years of silence, investigator Theriot knocked on her door. She had always remembered that necklace, the one her aunt never took off. The investigation even uncovered another poignant detail. Back in 1988, Dorothy had purchased a burial plot and headstone for herself. For decades, the marker stood engraved with her name, missing only a date of death. Thanks to the renewed investigation, Aunt Dot could finally be moved from her anonymous crypt to the resting place she had chosen for herself, bringing the number of unidentified victims at the memorial down to 29. While Dorothy Taquino's story was being pieced together with historical records, another 20-year-old Katrina mystery was being solved miles away in Mississippi, using the power of cutting-edge genetic science. The story of Tanetta Jackson is a heartbreaking one that briefly captured the nation's attention before fading into silence. On the day the storm hit, 46-year-old Tanetta and her husband Hardy Jackson were in their home in Biloxi, Mississippi. As floodwaters rose with terrifying speed, they scrambled into their attic. In a now famous and gut-wrenching interview filmed just after the storm, a dazed and grieving Hardy Jackson described the horrific moment the house was torn apart. He and his wife were swept into the raging floodwaters. I held her hand as tight as I could, he recounted, and she told me, "You can't hold me. Take care of the kids and the grandkids." Hardy managed to grab onto a tree and survived. Tanetta was swept away. About a week later, search teams found the remains of a black woman between the slabs of 2 destroyed homes nearby. With no identification, she was designated Jane Love and buried in a cemetery in Pascagoula, her grave marked as a victim of the hurricane. Hardy Jackson, who became a symbol of the storm's personal toll for so many, passed away in 2013, never knowing what became of his wife. The key to this mystery was unlocked by a technology that didn't even exist for law enforcement in 2005, forensic genetic genealogy. The effort was led by Lieutenant Darren Versiga of the Pascagoula Police Department, a dedicated cold case investigator. In 2023, the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation decided to exhume the remains of Jane Love. They sent skeletal evidence to Othram, a private lab in Texas that specializes in this new science. Othram's scientists used a technique called forensic-grade genome sequencing. Unlike the DNA testing of 2005, which looked at a small number of genetic markers, this advanced method sequences hundreds of thousands of markers. It allows them to build a detailed genetic profile even from old, degraded, or damaged DNA, exactly the kind of evidence that was previously a dead end. This detailed profile was then uploaded to public genealogy databases to search for distant relatives. By building family trees from these distant cousin matches, investigators can eventually triangulate and identify the unknown person. In this case, the process worked perfectly. The DNA profile led investigators to potential relatives. A DNA sample from a close family member confirmed the match. Jane Love was Tanetta Waltman Jackson. The identification, which came in May 2024, brought a painful 2-decade saga to a close for Tanetta's family, especially her daughter, Toni Waltman. She was finally able to bring her mother's ashes home. These two cases perfectly illustrate the dramatic leap in forensic capabilities over the last 20 years. In 2005, the primary tools were standard DNA analysis, dental records, and fingerprints. These were robust methods, but they had limits. The DNA analysis of the time required a good quality sample, which was rare in the floodwaters. Dental records and fingerprints were often useless because records were destroyed and remains were too decomposed. Fast forward to today, and the game has changed. Forensic genetic genealogy, the technology used to identify Tanetta Jackson, is the single biggest advancement for solving cold cases. It can identify someone even without a direct DNA match from a family member in a criminal database. Underlying this is next-generation sequencing, which allows scientists to piece together a usable profile from the most fragmented and damaged DNA. This evolution represents a paradigm shift in disaster victim identification, offering new hope for solving cases once thought to be permanently unsolvable. But behind every cold case is a family living in a state of agonizing uncertainty. Psychologists call this ambiguous loss. It's a unique and torturous form of grief for those whose loved one vanishes without a trace. Unlike a confirmed death, which allows the grieving process to begin, ambiguous loss traps families in a state of suspended animation, caught somewhere between hope and despair. The act of identification, even 20 years later, is therefore a profoundly therapeutic event. It validates the family's grief, transforms the ambiguous loss into a tangible one, and allows for the necessary rituals of mourning. It provides closure, a focal point for remembrance, and restores the simple human dignity of a name. For Jean Driggers, it meant finally placing flowers on the grave her aunt had chosen. For Toni Waltman, it meant fulfilling the promise her father made to her mother in the middle of the storm. The stories of Dorothy Taquino and Tanetta Jackson are powerful parables of the modern forensic age. One was solved through the relentless pursuit of historical clues, the other through a scientific revolution. As of 2025, 29 unidentified victims of Hurricane Katrina still rest in the memorial in New Orleans, with likely others elsewhere. Each represents a family still living with the pain of not knowing. But these two cases offer them a renewed sense of hope. They affirm a fundamental principle that every life is valuable and every person deserves to have their name remembered. The work of dedicated investigators, journalists, and scientists ensures that the pursuit of those names will continue. The waters of Katrina may have washed away lives and homes, but they could not entirely erase the identities of its victims, which, one by one, are finally being brought back to the surface.